Welcome to Curb Enthusiasm. I'm Emily Weidenhof.
And I'm Nick Carey.
On this episode, we chat with Dr. Wes Marshall.
Wes is a professor at the University of Colorado, Denver, where he holds a joint appointment in civil engineering and urban planning.
Wes is also a licensed professional engineer and the author of the recently published book, Killed by a Traffic Engineer. Hello up there in the mile-high city, Wes. Thanks so much for joining us today to talk. We'd like to start by hearing a little bit about what motivated you to write your book, Killed by a Traffic Engineer.
So thanks for having me. And I guess to start off with, I sometimes joke that a lot of this book came out of just anger. Like when I was a consultant doing transportation work, it drove me crazy that the stuff we were building was never as good as the stuff I saw in and around me near Boston, and where I grew up in Watertown, right next to Boston there. So I'm the kind of person that likes to ask why. So I would ask why, and sometimes you get an answer, sometimes you didn't. But usually there wasn't nearly as much good stuff or science behind that than I ever thought. I mean, those frustrations ended up leading me back to do graduate school and really wanted to learn more about this stuff. And my first project I worked on was a parking project. So I know you had Donald Shoup on recently, and he just passed away, which is very sad. But his work was really influential because you saw, the pseudoscience, he would say, behind parking ordinances and regulations, those numbers like the IT parking generation. And, eventually I had the time and wherewithal to go down a lot of other rabbit holes other than just parking. And it was a similar thing. There wasn't nearly as much science as I was led to believe, like in my classes, like in those manuals we're given as young engineers. Like the science wasn't what I thought it was. And that was, really what it came from.
Wes, I've been working as an on-again, off-again traffic engineer for almost 20 years, and reading your book was a very cathartic experience because so many times I felt frustrated with outdated standard design best practices, skeptical about some of the basic assumptions. And reading your book, you really delve into some of the logical fallacies and bad data that can drive poor decision making in our field. So it felt very freeing to read this. Like, I'm not crazy. But
I did feel crazy at some points as I was putting this together, but I'm glad to hear that. That makes me happy.
You also had some very egregious examples of bad policy leading to terrible outcomes. So we wanted to ask, with all your time in academia, what's the most interesting or unexpected research finding?
When I first thought about what this book would be like, I think my thinking was like, man, like we are so stupid. Like, why do we do X, Y, and Z? Like, and I could just point those things out. But then I realized that that wasn't enough. I really needed to understand why we did what we did. And that's why I went down those rabbit holes. So I was, ordering tons of old books from the 1930s, 40s on eBay and reading like hundreds of old journal articles to really understand what the engineers were thinking at the time. And in most cases, they weren't stupid. They weren't being evil. They were just saying, like, here's what we know as of today. Here's the study that makes us think that, for example, wider roads are safer. That's something I was taught in school. Like, wider roads are going to be safer. It gives people a factor of safety. And when you look at the original studies that say that, there's 3 studies in the 1930s that we used to cite all the time. And what's interesting about those is like the widest road they even looked at was only 24 feet curb to curb. So they compared 18 to 20 to 22 to 24. And yes, 24 was safer than 18 in that study. By no means does that suggest that 60 or 80 or 100 or 120 feet is going to be safer than 24. But we just sort of perpetuated that theory through time and kind of stopped citing the original research and stopped even looking at it. So many of those rabbit holes, I would find stuff like that. It's like, and I don't know, you find that, you get to the bottom of the rabbit hole and you're like, what? Like, really? This is seriously why we do this? Like, because of this? Or because like some guy named Carl raised his hand in one meeting when they were trying to decide on level servers? Like, that's why we have like that. Like, so many of those stories you get there, it's like, oh my God, like, I hope people realize how crazy it is that like we think this was steeped in 100 years of scientific study and safety research, but it was just early engineers like they're trying to do their best and admitting they didn't know everything. But we, over time, that stuff kind of got cemented into our manuals, into our thinking, into our mindset. So bigger picture, it was the interesting findings like that is more, obviously down some of the rabbit holes, I did find some people like the CEO of a car company trying to get us to measure safety to make us think cars are safer. But for the most part, it was engineers trying to do their best.
Yeah. When we're designing projects at DOT, working in diverse communities all across New York City, one of the challenges we face is perceived risk versus actual risk. And you talk a lot about the importance of both data-driven outcomes, but also storytelling. And I think those two components are incredibly important for communicating the benefits of a project. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things we all want is a more data-driven approach to safety. Like, it makes perfect sense. But one of the big themes in the book is how we misunderstand human error. So whenever any city is sort of looking at their crash data, you quickly realize you have this huge, massive human error problem. And it tends to lead you straight into things like education and enforcement as your solutions. I'm totally not saying we want to ignore bad road users doing unsafe things in the transportation system, but blaming them is only useful for like the police and the insurance companies. So engineers and planners need to ask why these road users were doing what they're doing, and treat every fatal crash or severe injury crash as if there's something we could do with engineering. So the storytelling aspect, that gets into it. So one example, for some reason I happened to come across a crash one morning where two kids in Vancouver, Washington were killed, jaywalking on the way to school. And I try to follow that news throughout the day. And there was two kids, they crossed the street where they shouldn't have. They get hit by a speeding car. And the way that crash ends up in our database, it's either going to be a speeding crash where they blame the driver, and there's going to be a jaywalking crash where they blame these kids. But if you take a second to try to figure out, well, why were these different people doing what they're doing? For example, if you look at the roadway, it's a 5-lane roadway with a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit sign that was really built with a design speed of 70. So it makes perfect sense why that driver is doing what he was doing. In fact, everybody in the road probably was speeding. So is it really an error if everybody's doing it? And then when you think about what these kids were doing, with the situation we put them in, the nearest crosswalk was a half mile away. And then you look at that crosswalk that we provided them, that's a half mile away. It's not that safe. It's not that great. It would be a tough place because you're crossing 8 or 10 lanes because they have the turn lanes up there. And then you look at the pedestrian environment we gave these kids between where they were and the crosswalk, and there's missing sidewalks. It's just a mess. So there's no good way as a pedestrian to even get to that crosswalk. So it's a combination of really understanding what the data is really telling us and what it really means, and not just taking it at face value, but also integrating that why question and bringing, understanding what these road users were trying to do given what they were experiencing, because they weren't trying to get hurt. They weren't trying to die, but, we put them all in a bad situation.
Absolutely. And I love that example. Nick and I were actually just talking about this. We have done so much at New York City DOT to think about how we center pedestrians in our street design. And so we created the pedestrian mobility plan, which comprehensively looks at pedestrian demand across the city. So we can really use that metric as a tool for what is guiding our design. We also think a lot about crossing frequency and how we need to be providing more crossings to accommodate the needs of people every day. But one thing that we're challenged with is the federal warrant, and also trying to explain the rationale of a crossing warrant for a signal. And you have a great example in your book of how, we probably weren't counting people swimming across the San Francisco Bay when we decided to build the Golden Gate Bridge. So I'm curious if, you could share a little bit about
that's that is another some research we did that was not in the book all that much. One of the things I think if we have a pedestrian safety problem or even a bicyclist safety problem, the easiest way to fix that is to make our roads so unsafe that you'd have to be crazy to walk or bike on them. So when you look at the crash data, you don't have any pedestrian crashes, you don't have any bike crashes, you seem like it's safe. So just looking at where pedestrians are, where they're crossing, like doesn't really give us the whole story. So that project was more, instead of taking the reactive approach to safety, take a more proactive one. So we asked parents around Denver, like, would you let your kid walk or bike on this street? And then we said, well, here's where your kid lives, here's where the school is. This is the shortest route, but given, sort of that level of traffic stress type thinking, it doubles. It goes from a 300-foot walk to like a half a mile walk, because these are the roads your kids would have to take to get there, if they could get there at all. So it shifts you into a more proactive sort of thinking in terms of safety. And when it comes to, I don't know, it's so hard, like when you're trying to be more proactive as opposed to reactive, but it speaks to like a different set of issues than I think we typically think about. It's tricky, but I think if we can do something like that, we start heading more in the right direction.
Hey listeners, we hope you're enjoying this episode of our podcast. For those of you who are as enthusiastic about transportation and planning as we are, we'd like to hear from you. You can submit topics and questions that you'd like us to cover at nyc.gov/curb enthusiasm. And now, back to our conversation.
I want to ask a question about some of the tools we use and what you think of them. You mentioned in your book that after the Interstate Highway Act was passed and there was federal funding up for grabs, that traffic engineers became obsessed with building highways, and they were maybe a little disconnected from the actual problems they were trying to solve, and it just became all about building highways as kind of an end in and of itself. I'm wondering, is there something similar to that today? Like, as a researcher, do you ever come across like a new instance of a bright, shiny object that maybe promises to magically solve all the problems despite being totally unproven?
Of course. I mean, I think you could say that with a lot of technologies, right? I mean, today, we talked about human error and the idea that education or enforcement are kind of what we lean into to try to fix those sort of safety problems. But the other approach is the sort of hope technology will save the day. And there's always that technological carrot hanging 5 years in front of us that, oh, don't worry, if 94% of your fatalities are human error, AVs are going to fix that. And historically, if you look at the history of technologies, it hasn't done that, at least the sort of different ones. Like there's, one example in the book I found of the forward crash avoidance technology. So the cars that have this, that would stop, like the idea is that it would help you from, rear-ending somebody, right? So the car will understand that you're about to do this and stop. So the thinking is that it would fix that problem. But when you looked at the insurance data, like the kind of cars that had that technology, instead of fixing like 90 or 100% of those kind of crashes, it only reduced it by like 7 to 14%. Like it wasn't nearly what we thought it is. And typically with technologies, it leads to other problems. Like I give this example sometimes. A neighbor of mine, we were like 10 years ago, we were driving up to the mountains to go snowboarding, and he had a new BMW, and he was changing lanes like willy-nilly and not looking, because he's like, oh, my car will tell me if there's another car there. So when you think about human behavior, if we had added that technology on top of what we normally do, like look over your shoulder or use the mirror or both, then it'd probably add to safety. But when we start replacing what we normally do with technology, maybe it doesn't quite work all the time. So like if the car gets dusty, which it does on those sort of trips, like is it really working? And like we know that with the pedestrian avoidance technology the cars have now, it doesn't really work at night. It doesn't work well with kids, and it doesn't work with people with darker skin as well. Like, so if people start relying more on that, and maybe they look down at their phone a little bit longer because they think the car will fix those problems, it might actually make safety worse. And like Peter Norton's book, Autonorama, like he goes through that history, and like every 20 years, we always have that technology dangling in front of us that's going to save the day. And it fixes some things, but it doesn't fix the underlying bigger problems. It's just like that carrot keeps moving ahead of us and is distracting us from doing the more fundamental things that we need to do.
Well, let me ask, what about like roadway engineering treatments? Because one thing I kept thinking reading your book is that we often vilify mid-century traffic engineers who built highways, but you pointed out that they're not bad people. They really thought they were solving the problems with the best solution available. And it scared me reading it. It made me think, are we doing the same thing? Is there some treatment that's really hot right now that we'll come to regret?
Yeah, I mean, back then they thought cars were the savior. I mean, just like you asked in the previous question. So they were trying to design around that. Like now we think things like autonomous vehicles are going to save us from that. But some of the differences between that is, I think I said this at the very beginning, like the early engineers admitted what they didn't know. They would say so time and time again. Like today's engineers too often think that those early engineers had already figured out everything for us, that everything we do is steeped in that 100 years of safety research. And like really nothing could be further from the truth. So that is sort of the differences. Like back then they admitted it. In the book, I also connect like the idea of medicine. So doctors have been around for 5,000 years. For the first 1,000, you could argue pretty easily that they might have killed more people than they saved. But it's an empirical science. Like they get better and better. And like slowly they learn things over time. Like transportation engineering, traffic engineering, we're like 100 years old. We're still kind of in that stage where we're killing more people than we save. And if we are an empirical science, we're going to get better and better. One of the problems I see is that we've become more theory-based than empirically based. Like we think the theories that these early traffic engineers came up with and tried is what works. But I mean, one of the fun things about transportation is so much that we do is counterintuitive, and the results are counterintuitive. So like we're not getting the results that we expect in our empirical data. So if we get back to being more based on empiricism, we can get back to building safer streets and safer roads and really start heading in the right direction and get out of what I think someday will be considered the dark ages of traffic engineering.
Yeah. And I think it also speaks to another point you make about feedback loops. And I think we're really privileged at DOT. We are an operational agency and we are the stewards of our streets. So not only are we the teams that are planning and designing and engineering our streets, but we're also taking care of them and, being held accountable to the public. And that creates a really robust feedback loop. And we're kind of constantly learning and evolving and, being nimble and responsive to the challenges that are in front of us. And I'm curious to hear about examples of strong feedback loops that you've seen between your research or your colleagues' research and the design and implementation fields.
I mean, yeah, there are simpler things we can do. Like road safety audits is a thing that's been around for a while, where you actually go out to location, try to understand how humans are actually using it, which isn't usually like we see in our microsimulation models. Like people are following all the rules in those models, but they don't in real life. So why? Like what are the real problems here? And that perspective leads people to focusing more on what we can do with design, what we can do with infrastructure. And like they've just been shown to be successful time and time again. At the same time, like those sort of efforts, like it feels like we're playing whack-a-mole. Like we're fixing one problem at a time. We're putting a Band-Aid here, a Band-Aid there. We're not fixing the underlying problems with the discipline, with our protocols in traffic engineering that led to these problems in the first place. So we need something more fundamental. Like the other feedback loops that I see, like Denver has what's called the Rapid Response Team, and we're one of the few cities, like New York City. I think you guys have, what was it called, SAFE, the Severe Accident and Forensic Evaluation Team. So after a fatal crash happens, like these teams go out to the site and do something similar to the road safety audit to try to make that location safer. The problem with that is that it's more reactive. Like we're sort of waiting for someone to get hurt before we do something. But at the same time, it's still so important because a lot of cities will just stick their head in the sand. They feel like, well, if we go fix that street now, it'll feel like we're admitting blame to that person having just getting hurt. And that's not the mindset you want to have either. So like we need to have feedback loops. Ideally, they'd be more proactive, but the reactive ones are still better than what we're typically doing.
That's interesting. our culture seems to have shifting expectations around safety, and even changing definitions. Phrases like safe spaces or microaggressions have entered the public lexicon. My kid is in elementary school, and bullying is a much bigger taboo than it was when we were kids. And schools are, very active about discouraging it as a means of improving safety. In the transportation world, specifically, we've seen the conversation shift from a more permissive approach that highlights personal responsibility, and maybe this unfortunate notion that crashes and injuries are inevitable, to an expectation that there are no crashes and that the risk of injury should be zero, and that it's the responsibility of government to prevent dangerous behavior like speeding. And I think this is a good thing, and it forces traffic engineers to, not hide behind standards as much. But can it go too far? Is there a risk that in this pursuit of universal safety, we end up designing streets that are so cumbersome that the users ignore the rules and opt out? How do we take this mandate for safety not to an Orwellian extreme?
I don't know. I'm trying to picture like what a street even looks like in that sense. Like to me, when we start building streets that are more, safer for pedestrians or safer for bicyclists or safer for kids or older people, like we're really, granting people freedom. Like to me, freedom isn't a car and being able to drive a car everywhere. It's the freedom to be able to use whatever mode you want. You can use other things, and walking, biking are part of that. So like the shift from the personal responsibility, like part of that is because it hasn't worked. Like we've been telling people to be safer for 100 years, and we know the research shows us that that doesn't work. Like we've tried scare tactics, and we've seen research to show us that that actually makes things worse. So I think we need to understand that culture is a part of it. Like the rules, the laws don't fix the problem. And we saw this with jaywalking 100 years ago. Like when they tried to institute jaywalking and they made a law, pedestrians didn't care. They just did what they always done. When they tried to educate them, they had Boy Scouts handing out the little cards. It didn't really help either. But when they started making fun of pedestrians and trying to shift the culture, like that's when big things shifted. And that's from like Peter Norton's great work from Fighting Traffic. But like that story, probably speaks to how we need to think about things now. We can't just rely on policy and laws and education to fix it. Like it's got to be shifting the culture too.
There's a passage in the book that I want to mention. It details very nicely how transportation is unique in civil engineering. It's short, I promise. It said, you wrote, "When we put in a bigger beam, the wind doesn't care. The design load remains the same. When we install a bigger drainage system, the rain doesn't care. The peak flow remains the same. But when we build a bigger street, people know. They may not realize it, but they know. They drive faster. They pay less attention. Safety doesn't remain the same." I love this passage for highlighting how human behavior is such a significant factor in our work. And on one hand, this is a big part of how transportation planning is such an interesting field because there's no straightforward right answer, and it's iterative and it's messy. But it also highlights what I've come to see as one of the central challenges of the profession, in that in engineering, you identify a problem and you solve it. But in transportation, the solution often changes the inputs. And your design can alter how people behave and maybe leads to new problems. Sometimes we throw our hands up and say, this is an enforcement issue. And you mentioned that in the book too, how this is a crutch that a lot of traffic engineers rely on, passing the buck, saying that the police needs to step up enforcement. And this struck a chord with me because I'm definitely guilty of saying this. But I think that design has its limits. How can we design for safety with an eye towards behavioral science if we can't rely on roadway users to follow the rules?
The problem is, like you were saying, is that, the way we figure out how big a beam needs to be, we figure out the design load, we multiply it by 3, and, we pick a beam that fits that. And anything bigger is even better. same with like a culvert, like you're saying. If once you figure out the 100-year flood, we design the culvert to be big enough, we can make it bigger. And like you said, Mother Nature doesn't care. But with transportation, that factor of safety mentality doesn't work nearly as well. If people behave the exact same way on a wide street as a narrow street, yes, it would work. But human behavior doesn't work like that. So there are things we can do with design, with the infrastructure. And you're right, there probably is a limit to it. What we're often not willing to do is also think about how like vehicle design plays a role in this. Like we could, limit our vehicles from going more than some set mile per hour in our city centers. Like we could do that. We have the technology. Like that's a place technology could help us. Like if you look at the research on at what speeds a pedestrian would die versus survive, like we know there's a big shift around 20 miles per hour. When you go from 20 to 30, like that chance increases so much. And like, yes, people aren't going to behave exactly like we want them to just based on the design of the street. But for the most part, we know they respond to the street much more than they do to the speed limit sign. At the same time, if you started layering some technologies on top of that, and we seem to be fine to do that with micromobility, like we limit our scooter speeds on the pedestrian mall in Denver or in DC, but we don't do that with vehicles. I mean, part of it is sort of the American way and the American thinking is like, how dare the government do this? But at the same time, the discussion devolves away from safety. So, I mean, all these design things can be used in conjunction. Like we haven't even talked about the vehicle size and all that stuff, but at the same time, that's a part of it. So we can use design in all these different ways to make things safer. And like there might be a limit in terms of what the street can do, but we need to keep trying.
I read that you are very passionate about mentoring and mentorship. And I'm curious if you could share your kind of hopes for the next generation of traffic engineers.
That's a good question. So, I mean, that factor of safety discussion kind of leads into it a little bit. Because, I mean, when I was a undergrad, I only took one transportation engineering course. Like we're taking structural courses and hydrology courses and all this other stuff, geotech courses. I only took one transportation course, and I ended up getting my professional engineering license in transportation, having taken only one course. I eventually went back to grad school and took like 10 more, and I realized I knew nothing. But I've talked to so many other traffic engineers and transportation engineers that actually took zero. Like the way our accreditation system works, civil engineering programs don't even have to offer a single transportation course. And those people have been working like 20 years in this discipline, having taken no courses. So when I think about what the next generation of engineers needs, starting with some transportation courses, right? At the same time, like, what else do you want them taking courses in? It might not be a course in hydrology. Like I might rather them take a course in public health or human ecology. Like or statistics. Like there's so many other useful things that I could see going into like how we could best educate our engineers. And I mean, bigger picture, I feel like we need people that are more generalists than specialists. I talk about this in the book a little bit as well. Like the specialists like are so focused on that highway and what that highway is doing. Like the generalists can understand like what is the highway impact on the people that live in and around this highway, and you start understanding like that aspect of it. Like two of my best master students did not have a civil background for whatever reason. They both had an undergraduate degree in biology. Like one had a double major with French, the other had a minor in French literature. But they, had a harder time kind of getting into the engineering bits, but they did so much better at understanding the context of the work we do. So I feel like we, maybe not taking all biology courses, but we need people that have that sort of broader education.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I often think of working at DOT as my third degree because I went to architecture school and then went to urban design school. And, as an architect, you could barely get people to draw the sidewalk. They really didn't want to leave the building envelope. Urban design, great from a systems thinking perspective, but there was never a transportation course or mobility and economics. And so, being at DOT and getting to think about all these things, I mean, the majority of of what we think about now is outside of the building envelope, and in the right of way. So important to think about all the different layers.
Yeah, and transportation engineers, very few of us are even offered a road safety course. Like there was a big study that looked at nationally how many there are, and there was like 19 total around the country. Like, so not only are we educating them enough in terms of just the basics of transportation engineering, we're not giving them anything on road safety. Like it's sort of, we're throwing them into the fire and hoping they can figure it out.
Well, speaking of asking the right questions, you mentioned growing up in the Boston area and walking and biking and using public transit as a kid. And now that you're a seasoned professional engineer with an accomplished academic career, what do you think is the biggest breach of public transit etiquette? Is it manspreading? Is it iPod music speakers?
No, I actually think it's people that try to get onto the train or the bus before they give people getting off a chance to do so. That drives me crazy.
That's mine. That's my top. Yeah.
It limits capacity, I'll tell you that.
Yeah.
But it's just, it doesn't make any sense. Like, hey, just hold off a second. Like, a lot of times I'm, taking the A line to my neighborhood. I'll have my bike on the train. And if people start coming on, I'm trying to get my bike off. It just doesn't work. And it seems so simple, but for some reason, it never goes right.
Yeah. Wes, what are you most enthusiastic about for the future of transportation?
I mean, so when I put this book out there, I just sort of thought I'd go back to my job and not have to really talk about it or do that sort of stuff. And I knew there'd be, some attention maybe from the advocacy community. But what I've been really enthusiastic about is how the engineering community has embraced it. Like a lot of them were thirsty for this sort of stuff. Like, of course, there is, it feels like a small minority of engineers that hate the title. Like, even though if they actually read the book, would see that I'm not actually blaming them, but they refuse to. Like I joke that they're sticking their head in the proverbial sidewalk as opposed to kind of taking this criticism. Because for me, it is self-reflective. I am one of these people that was taught this, that used this in practice. So that has been something I've been enthusiastic about, is like how, I've spoken at the ITE national conference, international conference, and places like that. And like no one's thrown a punch at me. I mean, people are actually very receptive to it. And I think the other thing I'd say is I'm enthusiastic about like just the fact it feels like we're getting back to fundamentals to some extent. Like sidewalks is like the most fundamental thing we can put into a transportation system. Like New York probably doesn't have this problem as much as other places, but I don't have to go far from my office in downtown Denver to get to some streets where the sidewalks just disappear, or like they're 2 feet wide and you can't even get a wheelchair on them. And you compare that to all the, the distraction we were talking about before in terms of technology. Like people are excited for AVs or Hyperloops or whatever. And for me, it's hard to get excited about that kind of stuff when we can't even get the dang sidewalks right. So the fact that feels like we're getting back to those fundamentals, like Denver has a new bill where now homeowners are putting money into a pot that's going to fix the sidewalks as a city, as opposed to just putting the onus on the property owners. So like those sort of fundamentals is where we need to start when it comes to things like safety and accessibility. And we can lead in the right direction from there. But start with the sidewalk, start with the fundamentals. We'll be better off.
Love it. It is so reassuring to know that you are doing this work on such important foundational infrastructure. Thank you so much for your time and your insight today, Wes.
Thanks, Wes.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Thank you, Emily. This was fun.